everyone, welcome to D Squared Classroom. Change of scenery, we're here in my home office. And today we're going to be talking about hemodynamics, which is a really cool subject because it's basically putting science to what's happening in the heart. And I just think it's amazing that humans are able to look inside the body and be able to quantify what's happening with the heart to such a detailed extent. So we're going to actually use the same chronology that we used when we talked about heart anatomy and physiology. Let's jump in. Let's start on the venous return side, which is where the deoxygenated blood is returning to the right side of the heart. The parameter we're interested in here is called central venous pressure, or CVP, and the normal range is 2 to 6 millimeters of mercury. That can be roughly associated with right atrial pressure, or the pressure in the right atrium, so that too is roughly 2 to 6 millimeters mercury. The next parameter that we're going to look at requires the use of a very specialized catheter that's introduced through the right atrium, through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary artery, and then all the way out to where the pulmonary capillaries are. That catheter is called a Swan Gans catheter, and it's often used during surgical procedures. As that catheter is snaked through the different sections of the heart, you're able to pick up pressures in each of them, including right atrial pressure. But ultimately, the parameter that we're interested in is in the pulmonary capillaries, and that's called pulmonary capillary wedge pressure. You can achieve this particular parameter by inflating a balloon at the end of the catheter, which blocks off the pressure from the right side of the heart and essentially represents the pressure on the left side. So wedge pressure, which is 6 to 12 millimeters of mercury in a normal healthy patient, is roughly associated with left atrial pressure. Moving on to the left ventricle, the parameter that we're interested in here is how much volume of blood actually makes it out of the left ventricle into the aorta with each beat. This is termed stroke volume, and a normal stroke volume is roughly 60 to 100 milliliters for each beat of the heart. The reason we're interested in that parameter is that it factors into cardiac output. And if you remember, the cardiac output equation is cardiac output is equal to heart rate times stroke volume. We can divide that value by 1,000 to get the normal range, which is 4 to 6 liters per minute. Now that we're up in the aorta, let's talk about the pressure there, which is called mean arterial pressure, or MAP for short. And it's literally a mean or average of the systolic and diastolic blood pressure. So we would take 1 times systolic blood pressure plus 2 times diastolic pressure over 3, and we can use 120 over 80 as an example, which results in a MAP of 93. Normal MAP is 70 to 100. Now let's move out beyond the aorta to the normal arterial system, or the systemic vascular system. What we're interested in there is what's the resistance that the heart now has to pump against. And that really represents the pressure in the arterial system, so all of those branches off of the aorta. Systemic vascular resistance is typically 800 to 1200. Let's go back to the parameter that we first talked about, which was central venous pressure. CVP is one of the things that factors into cardiac preload, which is essentially the stress that the heart is starting with. So when it's trying to pump, if it has a lot of pressure built up to begin with, it's going to make it more difficult or more challenging to pump. As opposed to afterload, which is the stress that the heart has to pump against, and that's roughly associated with that systemic vascular resistance. So while all of the hemodynamic parameters we discussed are important, a physician will often discuss cardiac preload or cardiac afterload when talking about a patient's status in heart failure, because that really helps represent the primary source of the problem and why the heart isn't able to pump effectively. Thanks as always for joining.